We're seeing something that I think is potentially a bit of a sea change in terms of how companies pay tax.
Okay, so Mark, diving straight in, it was recently announced that Google will pay an additional £130 million of additional tax. So can Google afford to pay this, and why have they agreed to do such a thing?
Right, I think there are two answers to that question. The first answer is really this is business as usual. Companies have been declaring taxes, filing their tax returns, talking with the tax authorities around the world for decades. And Google's tax settlement is really just the outcome of a normal process, which is the way companies pay tax. The second answer, however, I think is a bit more complicated. It's not very often when a company is under the degree of scrutiny that Google has been and other similar corporations on the amount of tax they pay. And I think it's fair to say that it's very unusual for the head of a government to basically comment publicly on a company's tax affairs, which is exactly what's happened off the back of the Google tax settlement. So I think we're seeing on one hand business as usual, a corporation being taxed in the normal way, but on the other hand we're seeing something that I think is potentially a bit of a sea change in terms of how companies pay tax.
Absolutely, it definitely seems like the winds are changing at the moment. So Google seemed to last year make a net sales profit of £3 billion. So is this money that they have to pay now as an additional fee, is it going to be detrimental to Google, or is it going to make a very small impact?
It'll make a small impact. You'd have to look at the company's financial statements in detail and probably know information that's not publicly available to be able to assess the exact impact. But the Google tax settlement basically is over a 10-year period, and it includes interest as well as tax. And so if you take £130 million and you spread it over that number of years, it's a relatively small number, especially in relation to the size of a company that Google is, at least today. So, and the company would have provided in its financial statements an amount of money that it thought was sufficient and appropriate for this tax risk or tax exposure. And so on a financial statement basis, there may be little or no impact on the company, and if it is not going to be material in the scale of things.
Absolutely, and I think the question that's posed now is, are UK tax regulations unclear for large companies? So for example, for Google, was it that Google was unclear on how much they had to pay? Was there a miscommunication? Or could you even go as far as saying that Google tricked UK tax regulators?
Right. Well, that's the question that I think a lot of people and a lot of the commentators today are really wrestling with. Is the system itself somehow fundamentally broken so the companies either don't know how much tax they should pay or can game the system, or is it that the system works properly but there's this miscommunication, as you say? I think there are two answers to that question. The first one is, I think the system is really under scrutiny today, and the question is a very open one: is it broken? There's a lot of people who will say no, the system as it's constructed and operates around the world works perfectly, it just needs to be adapted and brought up to the modern world and the way companies do business internationally. But there's, I think, an increasing chorus of people who are really questioning that. There was a fairly senior policymaker in the UK who came out a couple of weeks ago and basically suggested that the UK corporate tax system as we know it today should be entirely scrapped and replaced with a system that's based on turnover or other kinds of indicators of business activity. And I think that's an increasingly voiced concern or position. In Google's case, I think the answer is the rules are clear. Companies have enough information and certainly enough experts to know how much tax to pay, but there's always room for disagreement. And again, this goes back to the concept of business as usual. It's perfectly normal to take a tax position and then discuss it with the tax authority. And that's what's happened here.
Absolutely. And then when you look further into it, so the EU have promised to look into the deal with Google. So are we going to see a point where tax deal is different for Google in the UK and in the EU?
Another really interesting question. I think we're going to have to wait to see the answer to that. There are reports that other companies are agreeing or negotiating the end of tax settlements in other EU countries, France and Italy, that may be have a relationship to what Google has just announced in the UK. And it'll be very interesting to see if those tax settlements are in fact being negotiated and then publicly released, how they compare to what's happened with Google in the UK. And it would be an interesting situation then for companies to be facing the prospect of having to sort of justify or defend their tax position in various EU countries based on how much tax they actually agree paying. It in some senses takes the system and turns it on its head, in the sense that the system is based on rules and the companies understand the rules. It's not based on the results necessarily in terms of how much tax they pay, but that may be the situation we find ourselves in terms of comparing various countries.
Absolutely, and the question that I'm sure everyone is wondering is, will this deal with Google, will it set the way for other global companies and their relationships with the UK?
You know, I think it probably will. I think companies will certainly think more deeply and more carefully about how their tax positions are perceived publicly. This has been a realization, I think, that has been late in coming, but I think it's clearly now on the table. I think other companies will certainly be, and I think they're currently doing that now, assessing their tax position in the UK and elsewhere. And I expect that with the work that the EU has been doing and the OECD in terms of greater transparency in tax filings and so forth, companies will move into a new world in the coming years, and it won't be that many years before this happens, where transparency is really the name of the game. And companies are going to need to be comfortable that their tax positions are coherent, consistent among the various countries where they do business, and the public really understands them.
Absolutely, so watch this space, I guess. Well,
You bet.
Mark, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
And thank you for watching. That's all from myself and Mark, but for all the latest Györog updates and interviews, do keep clicking back. Goodbye for now.